Hi, everybody. I'm Weston LeBar, and welcome to another episode of People on the Move, a Cargomatic podcast. We're very fortunate today to have with us Bill Sullivan, Executive Vice President for Advocacy at the American Trucking Association, and Jon Eisen, Executive Director of the Intermodal Motor Carriers Conference, which oversees all the port and rail work throughout the country, those carriers. Also with the American Trucking Association, but the Intermodal Motor Carrier Conference. Guys, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about our discussion today, talking about basically all things policy that our viewers, whether they be shippers, carriers, or other, have to deal with. Bill, why don't you kick it off?
You bet. I am here at the Fireside, although I have to say it's springtime in Washington, D.C., and the swamp is starting to get a little bit warmer. We are, as a National Trade Association, we are coming off a year where we didn't expect a lot to happen last year. And I say that because a year ago, January, so, a year and months ago, Joe Biden was at the lowest popularity levels of his presidency. If we can put ourselves in that mindset, was also talking about the red wave that was coming in the November midterm elections. And, the predictions from the pundit class were that Congress wasn't going to do a thing. Why would Congress, give Joe Biden any wins going into the midterm elections? And this was with, while there was a Democrat majority in the Senate and the House, it was so thin as to effectively be tied. So if you couldn't hold everybody together, which is pretty darn rare, if you couldn't hold everybody together on one side of the aisle or the other. And lo and behold, last year became a year in which two really major legislative events happened for the trucking industry in different ways. And a couple of other things in legislation happened. A guns bill and codifying gay marriage, which the trucking industry is completely silent on. But, in a year that nothing was supposed to move, major pieces of legislation moved last year, which was terrific. If Congress is going to do stuff, we'd prefer they do good trucking policy. We also had a couple of big legal victories, the largest of which was a lawsuit in which we were fighting with the state of Rhode Island about tolling only trucks using the bridge loophole in federal highway policy. Rhode Island had conjured up this scheme to basically tax interstate motor carriers. Some happened to be in Rhode Island, and it was bad for Rhode Island, but it was on the East Coast, the I-95 corridor, it was horrible. So that was a massive victory that was more than 5 years in the making. Now it moves to appellate court. So the two major legislative pieces that moved last year, just for those who don't follow Congress every day, was the CHIPS Act, which was $52 billion. Sort of the core piece of it was $52 billion of support to bring chip manufacturing back. And I think our intermodal work is the bleeding edge of awareness about the kinks in the supply chain, in the global supply chain. Chips may not all move on ships, but some of them do, and a lot of them move on planes, but there weren't enough chips, period. So coming out of the pandemic, such a backlog, and especially and most salient to us in that legislation was chips of an automotive or truck grade for all the sensors and mechanical oversight that happens in commercial motor vehicles, which are lower margin chips. And so as the chip manufacturers, jumped back up off the mat, they, started with the highest margin stuff, consumer electronics, anything from phones to Game Boys to computers to the Internet of Things, and we're slower to pick up on automotive grade and truck grade chips. So the CHIPS Act does have prioritization that includes automotive and truck grade chips. So that was an important piece. And just as a country, in terms of national policy, all of those being in Asia is a big problem. The other one.
Well, just quickly on that, especially for motor carriers operating in a state like, California, who are essentially being forced to buy new trucks, right? Continuously upgrade equipment. And then at the start of next year, any new truck that you want to enter, if you're entering a California port into the drayage truck registry has to be zero emissions. And as you know, many of these trucks are being ordered, but they don't show up. And so that's a huge issue. And as somebody who had to unfortunately buy a new car at the end of last year, just dealing with the automotive chip shortage in general, it means you're going to have to wait longer and pay more to get that equipment. So I think that I wanted to just underline how important that is for so many of the members of the ATA, and especially for folks that are out here in states like California and some of the other states that then will follow the California environmental policies. This is a huge deal.
So, and I'll touch on California environmental policy before turning it over to someone smarter than me and Jon Eisen and you, but the other really important piece of legislation for trucking was the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, OSRA. And the beginning of the Biden administration had an executive order that talked about detention and demurrage fees, a very long executive order, but recognized the challenges that that the motor carrier industry, that the supply chain faces in the balance of activity, the balance of power, particularly in the intermodal space and in this global community and the global supply chain. So the balance of power has certainly been with ocean carriers for reasons that are understandable and go back more than 100 years. So we get it. That said, some of the consolidation with ocean carriers and the variety of equipment providing, the IEPs and chassis and boxes and tariffs and all sorts of things that play into that, it gives the motor carrier industry tremendous difficulty in keeping an affordable, well-functioning, tight supply chain together. And so we had worked with the White House, worked with DOT, worked with MARAD, many of the different government nodes, and along with our motor carriers and ports across the country. And the West Coast ports caught a ton of that attention. And Weston, I know you have a long history with West Coast ports, but we've seen that volume move around to try to get through some of the log jams. And Ocean Shipping Reform Act hopefully puts motor carriers on a more even balance. So just getting into this year, we have a very scarce majority of Republicans in the House. We have just passed a tie, have 51-49 Democrats in the Senate. So we have divided government. I think often Americans are more comfortable with divided government. We don't want a lot of things to happen fast and don't want major changes. And I like to think that's part of how the founders set up the system of government, was to have those checks and balances and not to veer left and right in rash decisions that you'll see in some other countries. But this year, a big focus in especially our regulatory efforts is what Weston already brought up with emissions policies. And so last week, in fact, we had the EPA approve of waivers in California, the Clean Air Act waivers that they requested for the ACT and I believe it was ACT and ACF, the Advanced Clean Truck and Advanced Clean Fleet. And we're not we oppose those because we need a federal regulator, and for one state with a handful or two handfuls of Me Too states following them, they're just it doesn't work for us to have a patchwork of 50 states or 15 or 20 doing this and the other one's doing that. Equipment has to be transferable across the country, across state lines. So we have not been a fan of that, and have said as much to EPA, and they generally have been really good partners with ATA and ATA with them. It's like phase 2 greenhouse gas heavy duty. We worked with them and achieved what I think are durable rules from 2016 until 2027. So we have concerns about a lot of those. And I know, Weston, you're on the bleeding edge again, like in California, but the one recent other development is we are hearing rumors that CARB in its NOx standards is finding out that there will be no equipment that actually meets those standards in a couple of years. No surprise there. You can't pass regulations that say flap your arms and fly to the moon. Either you are technically able to achieve those standards or you aren't. And on some of these NOx rules, 98+% of NOx has been taken out of emissions. And that last 1.5% is really hard to regulate with the existing structure that they have used and the sort of banding and stringencies and now they're getting into warranty requirements and all this sort of stuff in California. While we have sympathy with the Clean Air Act attainment in California, something's got to give, and there just isn't equipment out there. And our carriers are hearing who are trying to electrify are being told by either the state quietly and secretly or by the power company, PG&E or others, that no, they can't have chargers because there's not enough electricity on the grid for the units. And I'd love to say there are roughly 40,000 stations across the country at which a truck can get clean diesel fuel. There are 62 hydrogen fueling stations in the United States versus that 40,000, 61 of which are in California, and that's still not even enough, anywhere near what a robust network would be. So we've got emission standards. We had Chris Spear do a hearing on the House Ed and Workforce Committee. AB 5 and independent contractor rules in California continue to be a challenge for people that choose. This is about choice for people who choose to be an independent contractor. There are certainly abuses in all kinds of employment law, and we're not for that. But AB 5 effectively outlaws independent contractors based on their test, and so it's a challenging environment in the states, but it has been rewarding over the last year, and even more so now on some issues like truck parking and credentialing for drivers and some of the TSA cards that they have to get to operate in ports. We're working with the administrator of TSA, Dave Koski, to work to streamline that and have work in Congress. So there's a ton going on, and in the intermodal world, I'll kick it west to you and to Jon Eisen, but Jon Eisen's winning so much he's exhausted by winning. So
he told us that he's setting the bar high from day one, and he's just going to keep piling on the wins. I really think we've got a good guy in Jon Eisen being our eyes and ears in DC. But before we go there, you talked about the advanced clean fleets rule and the advanced clean trucks rule. And the fact of the matter is from a national standpoint, the big risk of having one state set their own policy and not having that federal oversight is we operate, as you pointed out, in a atmosphere of interstate commerce. And a lot of the equipment that we see registered, not for localized trucking, sometimes like a port drayage, but a lot of equipment is registered in states like Oklahoma, Tennessee, Arkansas, let's just say much more friendly states to the business world. And if they're moving across state lines, these large fleets, typically you got to figure out how do you deal with that interstate commerce issue, which, the federal government, by and large, over our history dating back to 1776, has said interstate commerce is untouchable. So, it's very interesting when you start to look at that from a fleet perspective. The second thing is just the manufacturing. We talked about the chips and the importance of equipment. Believe it or not, a state like California doesn't constitute the manufacturing hours on these assembly lines for the heavy duty equipment that you would think, even being how robust our state is in transportation. And that's a huge issue because as a manufacturer, you have to start to take a look at, do I manufacture for one state or do I manufacture for the other 49? And by and large, they're going to say, where do I have the biggest opportunity to make revenue and margin selling my equipment? And it's not going to be specializing it in a state like California, unless you're going to have less choice and you're going to have a much more expensive vehicle. And just think about what consumers have dealt with on the automotive market. Now, 2019, 2020, even, you could go in and the second you walked in a dealership, they were giving you 10 to 15% off of the car because they just wanted you to leave with it if you bought it that day. Today, you have to put a deposit down, make a reservation, pay full sticker price, and sometimes pay some sort of dealer surcharge. So we're talking about a gap when you look at it of buying just a consumer vehicle of sometimes tens of thousands of dollars because you went from a discounted product to a marked up product. And we're seeing basically the same thing in this industry, where trucks are more and more expensive. Even the used truck market, heavy duty used trucks are costing way more money than they did just a few years ago because they're in such high demand and there's not a lot of product out there. And then the third thing you touched on is infrastructure. Interstate commerce requires interstate infrastructure. And you can't have a lack of a network. And you brought that up with 40,000 fuel stations. We don't have local infrastructure here for the electric and hydrogen trucks at this point in time. And I think there's a split of opinion as to which one is going to be the prevailing technology. And when you talk about zero emissions, many people use electric vehicle as a synonymous term, but hydrogen's got a really big stake in this and a really good argument to them being the better technology, the more transferable technology. So this isn't a complete disruption to the industry. So there's so much more that goes into this. And to your point, this is really a federal issue, and it needs to be dealt with by folks that have the purview of all 50 states. I was going to say all 49. I've already annexed California. All 50 states in the union to say, what are we going to do on this trucking policy? And part of it should be tied into what are we doing with a national freight policy, right? And how do we make sure that this network works more equitably and efficiently for those using it?
Well, and the goal on this is one that we all share, which is lower emissions, lower fuel burn. But the reality of these other power sources is that they're not ready right now. You know, it's conceivable that hydrogen fuel cell or a different fuel cell could be, more sustainable or renewable natural gas or diesel or something as fuel cell vehicles. But even those require batteries for the fuel cell. So we get into critical minerals. We're having conversations with the people who actually make this kind of stuff and then use it. And I'll tell you, one company, huge company that will often operate contract trucks for retailers, was telling a story to me where a retailer for their local business, largely straight trucks, but still heavier duty trucks, was their customer said, we would like you to be all electric in these areas. And where they are, because of the utilization cycles, they have to buy 3 electric straight trucks to do the work that 2 carbon fueled trucks would do. So what does it mean if you have that much more steel and that much more battery and that much more input, sort of environmental input into a vehicle and the utilization cycles? And look, man, California, you all are looking at brownouts, rolling blackouts, all sorts of things where there's not enough electricity on the grid, keeping the Diablo Canyon nuclear. Like, if we don't have nuclear electricity, if we don't have modular nuclear or some kind of energy dense sources, there's no way that we have enough generation for electricity if that. So we worry a lot about picking the outcomes as opposed to partnering with innovation in a way, because all of our engine manufacturers and OEMs are pushing toward those goals and are not dragging their feet. The market's working pretty well, but when regulators start determining the outcomes and picking winners and losers, I feel like 30 years from now, people could be looking back, still not fully zero emission vehicles, but I feel like people could be looking back and waking up with a hangover because the outcomes that were sought are less environmentally friendly than improving on some of the technologies that have begun to exist today. So the fully electric vehicles may make sense. Even DOT published a study, the Joe Biden DOT, Pete Buttigieg, who's been a great partner with us, but even the Pete Buttigieg DOT pushed out a study that estimated that potentially less than 10% of heavy duty trucks might wind up being electric, and pointed towards hydrogen fuel cells as a better potential. I've heard of some who combust hydrogen, but those technologies and the infrastructure to supply them, again, contrasted against 40,000, roughly diesel fueling stations across the country, it just is not there. And the people who are trying this, that we hear, it's costing minimum $2 million per hydrogen fueling site. for a couple of trucks, not even for scale. So on the heavy duty side, I think maybe you can get away with like local and dray. I don't know, but what I do know is the government picking this is going to cause unintended consequences, and not the least of which being that people in those states, if they continue down the path that they're on right now, people in those states are going to have way more expensive goods. Inflation in those places is going to go way up.
Yeah, and I was just quickly before we transition over to Jon, one of the funny things is a lot of the policies that we discussed last year, and I think it's great that our industry is finally getting a real seat at the table. I think for a lot of people, logistics just worked, right? Supply chains just worked for a very long time. We dealt with the pain, right? In many cases, especially at the trucking level, of figuring out how to make it work and be agile, but at a time that resiliency is top of mind in the industry, and at a time when the Biden administration continues to talk about beating inflation and what can we do to lower the cost of moving things so it doesn't contribute to inflation, we're mandating expensive vehicles that don't have the same duty cycle. We're mandating labor laws that are going to increase the cost of doing business and decrease efficiency. And I could go on, right? But there's a lot that contributes to inflation, and it's not just pricing. And many truckers are raising pricing because they have to cover the cost of all these things. It's not because they're making a lot more money on the margin. Their cost of business keeps going up. And so I think one of the big messages that needs to be taken back to DC, and I know you guys are doing this, is if you want to fight inflation, you got to work with us on common sense regulations that don't make it impossible for folks to operate a trucking company without having extraordinary costs to do so. And that includes the labor, that includes the environmental, and that includes so many other things that really go into the cost of doing business. But Jon, I want to transition over to you because, you've really become the new Ray Lewis of the Beltway. You're tackling everything that's in front of you. You're just tackling it. And I think that's fantastic for us. But you do have some key wins that have come out of last year. And then you've got some key things that you're fighting this year. So maybe give us a little update of what the IMCC is up to, because I know I feel very proud that I get to be involved with the IMCC. It's an organization that, when I was at the HTA, I worked extremely closely with. You are the voice of trucking at the national level, and especially in the Beltway in Washington, D.C. But tell us what you've been working on and tell us what you're going to be working on, because there's a lot to fight right now.
Well, sure. Thank you, Weston. And I hope I don't disappoint with that kind of a buildup that you all have given me during the course of this conversation. But there's no question we have seen a great deal of development in the intermodal space over the last year and a half to 2 years. The volume that we saw during the pandemic and the difficulties it created in the supply chain got everyone's attention. During the State of the Union in 2022, the president used the words detention and demurrage as he was delivering the speech. I think I can't say for certain, but I feel pretty confident that's the first time those two words have ever been uttered in a State of the Union address. So there was an incredible amount of attention on the intermodal international supply chain and the impact we saw and the inability of companies throughout the supply chain to move freight through the system and the difficulties it created. And so it really led to a lot of regulatory and congressional focus on the issues we saw, and especially on the unfairness that motor carriers, shippers, and others were dealing with from foreign-owned ocean carriers. So as Bill mentioned, one of the key pieces we saw was the passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act last summer through Congress. It went through on an almost extraordinarily bipartisan basis. It was unanimous in the Senate, and it got more than 360 votes in the House. So it really did. The supply chain problems really captured the attention of the Congress and led to the passage of this legislation, which has turned out to be very, very eventful, both in what the legislation said and I think in the message it delivered to regulators, especially at the Federal Maritime Commission, regarding the interest of policymakers in what they were doing. I think in general, the FMC had not been something that had received a great deal of attention or focus. over the years. But the problems we saw during the last year or so, year and a half, certainly focused the attention of Congress and the administration on the activities of the Federal Maritime Commission, and we have seen results because of it.
Talk a little bit more about that, because Dan Maffei, as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, has really prioritized this. I think this is the most active commission, I would say, that we've ever seen. You've got very informed commissioners. You can't discount what Maffei has done, appointing, Carl Bensel on the data side. Obviously, Rebecca Dye has done a fantastic job of getting out and getting in the weeds with motor carriers, ocean carriers, chassis providers, basically everybody, to really understand this. And she created the interpretive rule that turned into OSRA. And I know many of us were in her ear through that entire time. And even their new appointee, Commissioner Vekich, Max really knows this industry, as a former longshoreman on the West Coast. And this commission's ready to get things done, but they have an important timeline coming up. So can you talk a little bit about next steps and the role the FMC is going to play in rulemaking moving forward?
Sure. And I think that's absolutely correct. The FMC has, without question, taken a much more aggressive stance than we have seen previously. And as you mentioned, it goes back even actually before passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act and the supply chain problems we saw with the interpretive rule, which was put in place in early 2020, on the interpretive rule on detention and demurrage. And so we are seeing some of, I think, the results of all of that. Certainly the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, I think from a motor carrier perspective, had probably two primary provisions that were key. One, it created a new charge complaint process for motor carriers who felt they had been unfairly charged detention and demurrage, and a way to file them simply and quickly with the FMC. And the FMC has moved that process forward very, very quickly and has taken up some cases already on unfairness around detention and demurrage. It also requires rulemaking on the detention and demurrage billing, which kind of follows the interpretive rule. So kind of the next step in the process on the interpretive rule that the FMC put in place. That rule, there was a proposed, the FMC is moving quickly to implement the requirements of law and proposed a rule in the fall around detention and demurrage billing requirements that would require that bills be sent to shippers, as an example, because they're the ones that contract with the ocean carriers and know the terms of the contract, and also would provide for very expedited timeframes for these bills to be sent. They'd have to be sent within 30 days, challenged within 30 days, and then disputes would have to be resolved within 30 days. So it would accelerate the timeframes for those bills very quickly. And that rule will likely go final, I think, probably sometime in the summer, maybe late summer. And that's a major step forward. I think the other thing we've seen from the FMC in just the last 3 or 4 weeks, actually, is a greater explanation around what they mean by what the interpretive rule actually means and says on detention and demurrage. The interpretive rule basically said that detention and demurrage is legal, and those charges are okay as long as they are designed to help freight, as an incentive to help freight move through the system. But the rule did not kind of clarify exactly what that meant. It was kind of a you know it when you see it type of situation. And just at the end of last year, the FMC in a small claims case actually ruled and provided much greater clarity on what they really mean by that incentive principle. And made it very clear that charging detention and demurrage when ports are closed does not meet that requirement and would be a violation of the regulation. And just in the last, the case that they ruled in was only against one particular shipping line, but in the last, I think, 3 weeks or so, they've made clear that is the way they view these charges, and that charging detention and demurrage for days the ports are not open is a violation of the regulation. So we're certainly seeing the FMC being much more aggressive and clarifying what they mean when they look at that rule.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd like you to touch upon quickly. Obviously, we have another major industry association not too far from you guys, the Intermodal Association North America, and they, under their purview, have the Uniform Intermodal Interchange Agreement. We all love the UIIA and what it does. But there's some discussion about, is it compliant with the new OSRA? And under the new rulemaking, does the UIIA need to have maybe not just a refresh, but an overhaul to make sure it conforms with the policy? I know it's something the trucking industry has talked about for a long time, is having more equity, a more equitable approach for all participants in the UIIA. It's been, very much the opinion of the trucking community. And I think the ATA, the CTA, the HTA, and many of the other associations around the country, bi-state motor carriers, and this other state associations, that it hasn't been a fair and equitable playing field. And any discussions with, if you can share with what's going on around the UIIA, because it really is the master service agreement that for equipment governs our industry. And it's been very one-sided thus far. And let's be honest, if you don't sign it, you can't do work in and out of the nation's ports and rail ramps. So what say you?
Well, I think you summarized the UIIA process and motor carrier frustration with it very, very well. And as we do look at the requirements of the ocean shipping rule, as these ocean shipping law, the Shipping Reform Act, I do think as we see these rules finalized, there will be some things that do come into conflict with the UIIA. As I mentioned, the billing requirement proposal, the timeframes that are contained in that proposal are very different than are in the UIIA. And there's no question that were that rule to be finalized as written, it would require a reexamination of many of the provisions of the UIIA. And I think, as you said, that's something motor carriers would be very interested in taking a much closer look at, because they have over the years, while it certainly has a very critical purpose, there are certain issues of fairness that motor carriers have had with the UIIA. And I think you kind of summed it up pretty well, exactly where we stand. So yeah, it most likely, as we get through the process of full implementation of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, I do think there will be some things that are conflicting with the UIIA that will have to be reexamined.
Couldn't agree more. So that's a big win. Obviously, it's a great way to get the year started coming into 2023. What else outside of OSRA is the IMCC really prioritizing? Because I know you guys have a lot of different things on your plate. Not only that, it's interesting because you have a very diverse membership. You've got port truckers on the West Coast. You've got rail truckers in places like Chicago and Memphis and other major rail hubs. You've got the East Coast and Gulf Coast port truckers. They all have different issues. They all have different needs, but you've got to figure out ways to work with the state associations to come up with, policies that benefit everybody. And let's be honest, stopping policies that are going to have a major unintended consequence or negative impact on the industry at large. So what's going on right now, and what are some things that our listeners and viewers should be aware of? And then I want to talk a little bit with both of you about the role of the ATA and just what is the ATA and how folks can get involved. So Bill, I'm going to come back to you in a moment.
Well, you're right, Weston. We certainly take a national view of the intermodal landscape, and what happened so much at the ports, got all the attention, but it was every bit as difficult at the inland railheads. And in fact, I think probably as it moved away from the ports, became actually more problematic. And there's been a lot of focus on that. Certainly, the issue of chassis has been an ongoing issue.
Right. It's an ecosystem, John, and it's just a network of nodes. And when you have a backup in one node, it will eventually back up other nodes. And the longer that happens, the more robust it is. And I think we saw that, especially in 2021, right? When the ships, 109 ships were waiting outside the nation's largest port complex. And then all of a sudden, they had issues at the Chicago railheads where a lot of that direct intermodal cargo is headed for. And they shut the train from, essentially Southern California to Chicago down for several weeks. It created systemic backlogs that rippled throughout the country. And to your point, that's the tough job of you at the IMCC is when you do something in one place, whether it be chassis in Memphis or whether it be appointment systems at ports in California or all points in between. How is that going to reverberate? How is that going to impact everybody? Because I think it's a butterfly effect in this industry.
That's very true. But I mean, overall, I think our focus is on fairness and efficiency. Motor carriers should be treated fairly by ocean carriers, marine terminal operators, all of the railroads, all of the other players in the supply chain. And we advocate very strongly for that. And then efficiency. Operating efficiently is in everybody's best interest. Removing as many roadblocks as we can from the process is important, and aligning everybody's goals to ensure that to make that the primary goal, that moving freight efficiently is the best thing for all players in the supply chain. And so that's kind of the view we take, is we look at all of the issues going around in the country and put them through an efficiency and fairness lens to make sure that everybody do what we can to ensure that all players are focused on efficiency. Motor carriers are being treated fairly by all of their partners in the supply chain. And so that's, I think, really what we've been focusing on over the last few years with, hopefully, some level of success during the last year or two.
Absolutely. So a couple of the things coming up. I know you wanted to give a brief update on the ATA, OSEMA, or I should say the IMCC OSEMA lawsuit. You want to give us just a quick update on that, and then we'll pivot a little bit into the associations and how folks can get a little bit more involved.
Sure. The IMCC did bring a case at the Federal Maritime Commission against ocean carriers and OSEMA regarding chassis provisioning. We have received the initial decision that came down at the beginning of February, and we prevailed in some parts of our case and were denied in other parts. That has been appealed by the respondents and is now before the Federal Maritime Commission. We will be filing our response, I think, tomorrow. And then we will see the FMC will rule from there. So that's about all I can say on that issue, but it certainly is something we've taken it's been a big focus for us.
And it's been a huge focus for everybody I speak to in the industry, is just understanding really how to solve these equipment conundrums, because in many cases, there's a lot of different things that can disrupt our supply chain. But the unfortunate thing is the policy as it pertains to chassis, and we have a very unique chassis model in the United States. Throughout the world, usually the motor carrier owns the equipment, right? And it's part of the package deal. And here, for many different reasons, that's not been the case. But as the industry continues to evolve, the policies around that equipment and how it's governed, for lack of a better words, has not. And so that's part of really what the issue has been, is as the products that have gone out, as the models that have been developed change, we're not changing many of the governing policies on the way that we utilize this equipment, and how, again, bringing fairness and equity for everybody, including motor carriers and the equipment providers, right? Having a balanced playing field. So,
and Weston, can I segue?
Yeah, please.
So let me make a quick point on the intermodal legal case. The only point I'd make on that is, when I started at ATA 7 years ago, the challenge and the animating principle within the Intermodal Motor Carriers Conference was, we need good business partners. We are not getting treated as business partners by others in the global supply chain, whether that's, ocean carriers, whether that's the IEPs, that we're, with detention and demurrage fees, with the lack of choice, with some of the challenges at maintaining equipment that wasn't theirs, whatever it was, a sense of being sort of held hostage, being this player in the middle of the supply chain, that those boxes don't go from the railhead or the port, but for putting it on some wheels and getting it to the end user. Almost nobody receives those boxes by rail, right? Like almost nobody receives them through any mode other than trucking. And for whatever reason, fees and abuses, but the goal of the intermodal motor carriers was, we just want good business partners. And so the legal action was a last resort. But let me then segue over to, you were touching on this, but sort of the ATA and a national trade association. We're a federation of 50 state associations. The key goal for us is to be able to influence public policy, and the powerful thing that we're able to bring to the public policy making advocacy is consensus. And so wherever we can gather enough voices together that have a shared opinion, where there's not disagreement. So we have to be a facilitator through the meetings, the type of things that I know you're familiar with, but most people don't live within a trade association. And the policy committee meetings and the board meetings and things that are free time, people who have day jobs show up to meet and discuss, you name it, speed limiters, detention and demurrage fees, whatever the sort of bits and pieces on safety or trade or intermodal motor carriers. But we have discussions about these, and we need people's voices for it. We need people in California and in Charleston, South Carolina. We need people across the country to give John and me and the other motor carrier members, allied members who make equipment, sell insurance, do hiring firms, like all the different things, companies like Cargomatic. We need all these different voices who have eyes and perspective that we don't, so that we can shape public policies that have consensus. Because when we have consensus, we can go to DOT, we can go to Congress, and regardless of people's perception about partisanship, we can take these policies and say, our membership stands together in every congressional district in the United States. This is really important to the supply chain. We're a single-digit margin business. There's not a lot of fat in there. And because of that, these regulations will help or hurt efficiency or safety or costs. And that consensus means people join in and people being willing to share their expertise, what they see, what they know. I am fluent in trucking, but I often say I'm not an expert in the trucking business. I'm an expert in government. So what we need are people who understand the trucking industry, who understand intermodal motor carrier challenges and opportunities. And that's the sort of fun thing about working for a trade association is you get to learn how things are happening in the Midwest and in the West and in the South and all over, to be able to inform, well-intended, in almost every case, they're well-intended policymakers who just aren't experts on what we're experts on. So, that's the beauty of a trade association. It's just this collective voice that we pull together. And, sounds kind of cliched, sounds a little bit corny, but it's true. And, John does an amazing job of facilitating intermodal motor carriers. We have, similar in other sectors of the industry. And then more broadly, we have Safety Policy Committee, Workforce Development and Labor Policy Committee, Tax Policy Committee, all these different areas that we depend on companies and individuals who are experts in trucking to tell us what works and what they need, what they can't achieve. It's one of the most fun things I've ever been able to do has been working here and working with people who do know what the impacts on people's lives are, in terms of the hiring, in terms of the business, in terms of inflation, you name it.
Yeah, you touched on a few things. And the first is you're the voice of your membership, right? Your membership is really who you're advocating for. And it's not about being a Republican or a Democrat. It's about the trucker party and what's best for this industry, which what I think so amazing about our industry is I always say we're the most essential industry because nothing else can survive. You basically said it, but if someone bought it, a trucker brought it. And we need to understand that these policies that are being put in place are not just to benefit the trucking industry. They actually benefit every single person, whether they be environmental regulation or whether they be policies that help get things from point A to point B cheaper, faster, safer, more efficient, right? And so I think that's a huge thing to understand. And the more members an association has, the more powerful they are in the eyes of these elected officials. And you said it, it's a federation of 50 associations. So for those that are motor carriers or affiliated with the motor carrier industry, I highly encourage you, join a state association. That's the first step. And that makes you eligible to join the American Trucking Association. Join the American Trucking Association, give more power to that voice in Washington, D.C. and state capitals throughout the United States. And quite frankly, help shape that policy at those committee levels and help create that broader voice of consensus that these folks, Bill and Jon, can take to the Hill and say, this is what America needs. So that's my call to action for all of our listeners out there. And Jon, maybe just talk a little bit, because, as a new board member for the IMCC, I pick and choose what I get involved in, but this was at the very top of my list because of all the great work that you guys are doing. And obviously the role Cargomatic plays in the national supply chain in ports and rail ramps throughout the nation. So give us a little bit of that sell on the IMCC and how to get more involved, not just in your conference, but the committees.
Well, thanks again, Weston. You certainly set these up nicely for us, and we appreciate it. Our goal at IMCC is to be laser focused. ATA has a very broad waterfront of issues that are important to the trucking industry, and IMCC, we represent and focus on those that are critical to intermodal carriers. And certainly, I think the results kind of speak for themselves, that having that tight focus can bring results. And there are some critical areas where we are continuing to push and ensure that we are speaking for this segment of the industry, for the motor carriers that operate at the ports and the inland rail facilities. And certainly becoming involved, as you said, becoming involved in state associations, becoming involved in ATA. There's across the ATA, if there's whatever it is you're interested in, we've got something there for you to become involved in. Whatever your concern is, we are addressing all of the issues that are important to intermodal carriers in my particular case, and all motor carriers across the country in the case of larger ATA. So there is room, and we need, as you said, we are the voice of the trucking industry, and we need the involvement. We succeed because of the involvement of our membership.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you both for joining us. We're out of time, unfortunately, and I know you guys have busy days. Speaking on behalf of all of us and carrying that water literally up the hill. I know they're on recess now, but that just means there's opportunity to get the members out and meet with them in district and continue to say the good words that we need to get the right policies either enacted or beaten. So on behalf of Cargomatic, I'm Weston LeBar, and this is another episode of People on the Move. Thank you, Bill and Jon, and hopefully we do this again sometime. This was fantastic.